So today I'm here to talk about all the books I plan to read this fall for spooky season, covering the months of September, October, and November. I'm only going to be talking about backlist books, so it won't include any review copies or any books that I plan to reread. And I have a lot of books to talk about them. A lot of them are horror, unsurprisingly, because it is almost Halloween, and I'm definitely finally in the mood for all the creepy, spooky stuff. It feels like it's been a hot minute since I've read some of these good books, and I just want some new horror favorites. Hopefully I'm going to find them this fall. And so that all sounds good. Let's get started. Now, first let's talk about my patron picks. I always have a link down below if you want to support me there. And so with my book club, we do a couple different things. So each month we pick a book that we are going to read together. And then my top tier patrons also have the option to recommend me a book to read each season. And so this season, the book that was nominated and won was Station 11 by Emily St. Mandel, which probably surprised a lot of you that I haven't read it. It is, of course, by a Canadian author. And I remember it being described as a cozy apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic story, which definitely sounds intriguing. It's supposed to be very Canadian in its mannerisms and is also very much centered around this Shakespeare traveling troupe. And so it's one that's intrigued me. It's one that's been on and off my TBR for years. It goes up in interest level and then something else always steals away my attention. And so I'm glad I'm finally going to get to this one. I hope I love it, and either way, I'll let you know. So then as a book club, we're going to be reading a book together each month this fall. For September, we're going to be doing a reread for me, and that is Under the Skin by Michelle Faber. I've actually done a full review of this book, but it follows an individual who is hitchhiking in the Highlands, and of course, nefarious things happen from there. It's a book that I really think you want to go into without knowing too much, so I'll leave it there. Looking forward to rereading it. It was one of my personal favorites the year that I read it, and I really want to see if that holds up because, as I mentioned, my tastes continue to change and evolve, and so sometimes a favorite at one point may not be a favorite later down the road, and sometimes it completely holds up, which I certainly hope is the case here. Then for October, we're going to be reading The Anomaly by Michael Rutger, which I believe is a horror book that is very much inspired by something along the veins of Indiana Jones. So you have someone who is possibly going through and unleashing some sort of ancient evil. I don't know much about it, but it sounds like a really fun romp. I remember having several friends read it and enjoy it, so I'm hoping I'll like it too. Then for the month of November, of course, we'll be reading one more book, but at the time of filming this, I don't know what that book will be, so I'll keep you posted. If you're interested, you can always follow me on Patreon to find out more. All right, now let's move on to the official horror portion of this video, and so it's the largest section. During the summer months, if you remember my summer TBR, I did read a lot of fantasy and science fiction, and so for those of you that come to my channel for the horror and dark fiction, don't worry, it always swings right back when the fall season comes around. Suddenly, I am here for it, and it always rejuvenates that energy when I feel like I might be getting a little bit tired of horror and have this panic moment that I need to rebrand my channel. Then suddenly Halloween comes around and all I want to read is the spooky stuff. So the first book I want to read is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas, which might surprise a lot of you that haven't read it yet. It follows, I believe, a group of horror writers that agree to spend the night in a place that is supposedly haunted. What could possibly go wrong? And of course, things do as expected. This is one that was big and buzzy on BookTube many years ago. It's one I've actually tried to read in the past, but at the time, the beginning just wasn't grabbing me. And again, as I've said in a previous video, if a book's not grabbing me, if possible, I will actually pause it rather than pushing through just to have a bad experience with a book, particularly with a book that I think I'm gonna like. And so it's been a couple of years since I've attempted to read it, and I have seen a lot of shifts in my reading taste, so I'm really hoping that this one will work a lot better now. And again, if I'm ever going to read a book like this, I believe the book is set on Halloween, so it seems the perfect time to do it. And finally check this one off my list that has been there way too long. Next is Ghost Road Blues by Jonathan Mayberry. This is the first book in a horror series that follows a town where there was previously a horrible massacre that had happened. And then since then, they kind of buried their past and became a tourist spot. However, with Halloween approaching, apparently there are new murders that are now happening, and potentially what happened before is going to happen again. So I believe it falls into that small town folk horror genre where there's a town that is trying to repress the evil, and of course that evil comes back. Again, I believe this book is set in October and specifically leads up to Halloween, and so again, perfect time of year. I've been patiently waiting to try this book until the spooky season arrived, and it is finally almost here. Next, we have Maplecroft by Sherry Priest, which of course is the retelling of the infamous story of Lizzie Borden. I'm actually not overly familiar with the details of that supposed incident, and so I do want to do some research before getting into the book. And I'm hoping that this book is going to be playing into something similar to Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood, where we have a woman at the center of the story with accusations around them. And I believe the positioning of this book, I might be wrong because I'm often wrong with TBR descriptions, is the fact that this book might play around with the question of was she actually guilty, or perhaps there's more going on. I really tend to enjoy a story where it is not simply as it seems and there is more complexity going on, and particularly when we have a woman who is being accused of something that maybe they're actually not guilty of. But either way, whatever the story ends up being, I've got to check it out for myself. It's been one of those that have been sitting on my Goodreads shelf for a really long time, and sometimes it's just good to get it off the list, to check it off and move on to newer books before my attention gets again pulled away by something new and shiny. I also want to read The Strain by Guillermo del Toro. I'm probably saying that a little bit wrong. My apologies. It's the first book in a trilogy that centers around vampires. It's one that I've heard really good things about, although arguably I don't hear a lot about it online, or at least the circles that I live. It's supposed to be, I believe, an action-packed vampire story. I'd also like to get into more horror series because I'd really like to eventually do a top 10 horror series video. Someone requested that I do that. And I realize that nearly all of my favorite horror books are standalone. So if you have other recommendations for other horror series books I can get into this fall, I'd love to know. But this is one that, again, has been on my list for way too long, and I'm really hoping I'm gonna love it. Fingers crossed. Next, we have The Nest by Gregory Douglas, which is a vintage horror book that centers around spiders that I think are found in the dump in this nest, and then of course go off to be monstrous terrors. So it's a creature feature. I don't know much more about it, but I definitely love the idea of spider horror. I'm not exactly afraid of spiders, but they're still really creepy in how they move, so I think there's some definite potential there for some creepy crawly suspense, and I'm hoping it works for me. It should be a fun read either way. I also want to read The Amulet by Michael McDowell. This is one that centers around, I believe, an amulet that has some kind of curse around it. This is an author that I've been trying to get more into. I know so many people that love their work. I tend to be very hit or miss with Southern Gothic horror, and so this is one I'm going to try. It's available to me, and I don't hear as much about it compared to some of their other work like Blackwater. So sometimes the underhyped pick works a lot better than the popular one for me. So I'm going to start here, see how it goes, and as always, I'll keep you posted. You know that. Next is Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews, and this is one I honestly know nothing about other than there is something in the attic. It's one of those books that constantly shows up on lists of the most messed up books you can read, which that alone is all the description I need to try it for myself. So this is a case where don't tell me more. I'm going to experience it very blind. I will let you know how I react to the book, hoping I'm going to love it or at least have a strong reaction to it, because sometimes that's what I'm looking for, is just an experience, even something that turns me off or is disturbing. I'd rather feel something than nothing at all. Let me know if you feel the same way when it comes to dark fiction. I also want to read Drawing Blood by Poppy Z. Bright, which I believe is one of their vampire stories. I don't know too much about this one. It's an author that I've been wanting to try for quite a while. Again, an author that constantly shows up on lists of writing the most disturbing books ever. I have other books by this author on my TBR, so if you think that one book is better than this one to start with, let me know, because I definitely can swap it out. I'm not dead set on this book. I just definitely want to read something by this author this season because I've been putting it off for too long and it's finally time. And last, I want to get to Elizabeth by Ken Greenhall. I've read a book by this author before. I believe it was called Child's Grave. This one centers around a young woman named Elizabeth, and when she looks in the mirror, she discovers that there's more to her than it seems. The synopsis on Goodreads is really vague, and I want to keep it that way. It's a book that I'm intrigued about because I did enjoy, for the most part, the other book by this author, and just want to try this one out, see how it goes. And again, I'll report back, as I say with every book in this video, don't I? Now let's switch over to science fiction. I have 3 books to talk about here. Spooky season just isn't the time of year that I really crave big science fiction books, but again, that always swings back in the winter, so don't worry if you're normally here for the sci-fi content. I will still have videos coming on these topics. And so the first one I want to get to is a biggie, and that is The Mode of God by Larry Niven. This is one that I understand is a big, epic invasion story involving aliens, and I think it has some horror elements, which as soon as you say that always piques my interest, so hopefully I'm correct on that. Again, I don't know a lot more, but it's one that people tend to either love or not, and I really want to get my opinion in, obviously hoping to be on the side of loving it, given the fact that I tend to, or at least want to love a lot of alien invasion stories. I feel like I need to read more of those. I'd love to do a top 10 on the topic, but I haven't actually read as many as I think I have, so I need to change that, starting with this book. Next, I want to read Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This is a either post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic story. I remember in 2020, this book was referenced a lot as being very reminiscent of what was happening at that time. And because of that, a lot of people were reading the book. And for the same reasons, I was not reading it. Now I feel like I have enough space from those events that I'm interested or open to reading more apocalyptic fiction in that nature. So I'm hoping this one will be palatable. Octavia E. Butler certainly packs some punches and can write some really uncomfortable works, but I also really like that about her work. So I'm hoping I like this one again. Unless I have a really negative opinion, I very much likely will be continuing on to the second book. And even though the series isn't finished, I just have to check it out and see what all the love is about. And finally, for science fiction, I want to get to The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. And I believe this is a long-running series. A lot of times it is bound up into larger volumes. And so I understand that this is a classic narrative that follows the idea of science fiction in a regressed society. So it reads more like fantasy, but it is technically science fiction. And I've come to really enjoy when these genres are blended together, as long as they have the right balance between the two. And this one I know is the inspiration for a lot of newer works that do the same thing, which I often have read. And so I really always like to go back to the beginnings. I think it's important for me to read the older works before I read too many of the modern retellings and really get to see where it all started, seeing the foundations and seeing ideally that done at its best, because I know this book has a lot of praise around it, or the series rather, and I really want to see it for myself, and obviously I hope I'm going to love it. And finally, I want to talk about fantasy, and I'm trying to pick out books that have a bit more of an atmosphere or spooky tone to them. The first one is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, and this is a magician fantasy story that centers around a world where magic has departed. I know it's a really big book, and it's really intriguing, and how you're writing a magic book without magic. I know this book is being compared to Harry Potter, which normally is a complete miss when it comes to any of these book comparisons, but I still want to try it out for myself and go in without any expectations and see what I think of it. And hopefully it works for me. I wouldn't be picking up any of these books if I wasn't hoping for that, right? Next, I want to try Uprooted by Naomi Novik, which I believe follows this small village where every year a young woman is selected to go off with this wizard that protects their town. He's known as a dragon, but he's not actually a dragon, he's a human. And he goes and takes her away. And so we follow the story from the perspective of the young woman that he takes. And of course, the story goes from there. This one, again, just has some really atmospheric vibes that I've heard described from other reviewers. And I think it's a bit of a young adult crossover, so I'm hoping it doesn't read too young. But I've never read this author before, and it just seems like the kind of book that's appropriate for the fall. And so I'm curious to finally check it out for myself. It's been sitting on my TBR since this book first got published, and originally had a lot of buzz around it at the time. Next up, I want to read Fever Dream by George R. R. Martin. I'm currently doing a reread of A Song of Ice and Fire, and so it's reminding me that I want to get to everything that this author has written, because I really do love his writing, his stories, his characters. This, I understand, is a vampire story, and I don't know much more about it other than the author. That's really all I need at this point to put it on my TBR. And again, I'm hoping, because it leans into the vampirism aspect of it, that it's going to be a horror fantasy and have enough darkness to really bite my teeth into. Pun not intended. Last, I want to read The Grand Dark by Richard Cadney. This is a popular author, but I don't hear a lot of people talking about this series. This is somewhat of a fantasy steampunk world set all around this particular city. And this book is compared to Perdido Street Station, which is another book I really enjoy. So I'm hoping it's going to have similar atmospheric vibes to it. And again, it's the kind of book that, from the descriptions I've read, I think will lean into something that I'll like during spooky season. While it's not horror by any means, it's going to have that dark, weird quality to it, where it's less of a proper traditional fantasy with knights and princesses, but instead be something a little bit weird and different, which is always something I'm looking for with my fantasy books. So hopefully this scratches that itch. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about. Are there any that you're planning on checking out this fall, or what are your spooky season plans? Love to have that discussion down in the comments below. If you're new to my channel, do consider sticking around. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, basically all the genres I just talked about. And I'd love to have you along for the journey. If you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a big thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even just an emoji, something to represent Halloween, like a pumpkin. And if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.